He moved through the rooms with a steady presence. His steps had slowed with age, and his corrections softened into gestures of affirmation rather than sharp rebukes. He took on small rituals that mattered. At events he insisted people wear name tags and to write their roles clearly. He would sit at the library table while people filled them in, watch the ink dry, and then give a precise nod that felt like an endorsement. At a reading group for seniors, he once mispronounced a young volunteer's Korean surname. He apologized in his frank, unadorned way and added a compliment about the volunteer's patience. He was the kind of elder who taught younger people how to be visible by modeling a decency that didn't demand acknowledgement in return, but which insisted on public correctness when it mattered. There was a cost. Years of saying yes to the right rooms left my private time thinner. I missed quiet January evenings when I used to read fiction in front of the heater. I learned to schedule sabbaticals of a sort, an afternoon dedicated to doing nothing, a Sunday off limits to calls. I found that setting boundaries publicly made those boundaries easier to maintain. When I told a funder I couldn't attend a gala because I had committed to family time, they respected it, partly because the patterns of my life had become recognizable and consistent. And when I did show up, I was someone who had closed other doors. There were private victories that were no less meaningful for their smallness. On a school visit, I watched a 9-year-old translate the title program coordinator into her family's language and mime the work with gestures. She beamed when the teacher repeated the translation aloud. She had not only learned a word but also learned to map it to action. That is the kind of change that ripples over time. A child who sees organizing named and acted upon might grow into a person who notices labor and refuses to let it vanish. As the holidays rolled forward, the pattern at our table shifted. Younger cousins who once assumed relatives fit neatly into domestic boxes began to ask precise questions about what helping run that center actually entailed. How many volunteers did we have? Did we track retention? Was there a way to help without a long-term commitment? Those practical questions invited participation, and I found joy in them. At one Thanksgiving, a cousin I barely knew asked, "How can I get my boss to sponsor your literacy program?" I gave a brief, practice spiel and added, "If you'd like, you can come with me next week and meet the kids." He did. He brought a box of books, stayed for an hour, and the next day wrote to ask how to repeat the visit with his company. Small acts of curiosity had become small acts of support. My relationship with my parents settled into a rhythm still novel to all of us. My mother began to tell a story about me in new tones. Not only the daughter who could make a casserole carry an evening, but the person who negotiated sanitation contracts and insisted that volunteers be named. She loved the part about a stray dog that wandered into a center once and how I found a shelter for it. Her telling made community work human, a family tale that made our neighborhood feel cozier and more plausible. There was forgiveness in that new storytelling, an easing of the embarrassment she once felt about names that sounded too grand. She now used the word organizer with a pride that surprised me. My father, cautious with public statements, told people at the corner store that his daughter sets up the systems that make help work. He relished the sentence, as if it contained all the proof he needed that I had built something useful. I still correct introductions sometimes. Not with dramatic flourish, but with a practiced economy. If someone calls me the maid now, I answer simply, "I'm Elaine. I build programs." That response unhooks the stereotype without making a fuss. The room adjusts, conversation continues, and often someone asks a follow-up that genuinely seeks to learn how to help. Those arcs, of being misnamed, of correcting, of having the correction land, are now common enough that I've seen them ripple into policy, into practice, into the habits of a neighborhood. When I teach, I begin with a simple exercise. Name one person in your life who does invisible labor and say their name out loud. Then we talk about the effects of naming. People cry sometimes. They laugh sometimes. They take notes. The room becomes a place of small confessions and practical commitments. We leave with a list of actions, send a thank you email, include a credit line, update a brochure. It's not glamorous. It's routine. It's effective. If there's an overarching lesson, it might be that dignity travels on the backs of practical things. Names, minutes, lists, budgets. Those are the tools that make human recognition durable. Language is the workbench. Sometimes language reshapes relationships gently, Sometimes it does so with the insistence of bureaucracy. It can provoke a cousin's tremor of discomfort and, over time, coax a family into learning a new grammar of regard. At the end of each year, I set the casserole lid down with the same care I once used to hide a title. The lid carries the faint brown of a dish that tasted like family and work interwoven. I pass dishes now, and names, and practical requests. Young people learn to say what they do, elders learn to listen in ways more precise than corrective. The room hums in a way that sounds like repair. Forks click, conversations loop, a baby gurgles, someone asks where the recycling bins are. An ordinary question that, if answered well, becomes another small act of care. This work is unfinished. There will always be people who prefer the comfort of small narratives that flatten complexity, who steady the old introductions because they are easier than learning new ones. There will be seasons when funding moves in ways that test our commitments and when names on paper don't translate into paychecks. But for every erasure there are ministrations of attention that insist otherwise. A name on a flyer, a brief thank you at a meeting, a city form that requires named contributors. These are tiny systems of justice. I tell the story less as an origin myth and more as a set of tools. Plate by plate, sentence by sentence, we can change how people see one another. Someone once introduced me as the maid. Someone else, unexpected, polite, correct, used a different sentence that opened a room. That second voice mattered because it taught people how to speak of one another. Today I still carry the casserole lid, but my hands are steadier. When the next person is announced, the door opens and someone says a name and a role. The room listens. The work goes on. Small, clinical moments of correction still surprise me with their ripple. I think back to that Thanksgiving when my parents, out of habit or embarrassment or a stubborn attachment to old shorthand, introduced me as the maid. The room tilted for a beat, the way a conversation does when everyone recalibrates. Then a woman I had met only once, here for the meal with a mutual friend, looked up from her plate and said plainly, "She's the program director at the literacy center, isn't she?" Her sentence aligned facts. It was not theatrical. It taught a grammar. It taught cousins who measured people by domestic competence, an uncle who liked tidy categories, and parents with complicated histories about titles how to name work without shame. After that, the conversation shifted. People asked what that really meant, not out of novelty but genuine curiosity. The woman stayed long enough to hear a volunteer story and later left a note asking how her office could partner with the center. She became a small, practical gateway, somewhere between a polite corrector and a collaborator. Since then, a sequence of small inflections has followed. The bureaucratic world is clunky, but it learns when nudged. There are limits. Naming must be calibrated with protection. We still have colleagues who fear publicity because recognition can lead to danger, harassment, workplace retaliation, immigration trouble. That's why the protocols we developed in the guide are not sentimental. They are logistical. They create pathways for recognition that can be paused, redacted, or anonymized. Recognition without safety is a cruelty disguised as praise. I learned to ask, will naming this person help them, or will it expose them? The answer shapes how loudly we speak. The emotional ledger of this work is complicated. I've been thanked publicly in ways I didn't expect, a city proclamation, a ribbon on a program, and those moments land differently than private thanks. Public thanks make the work legible to systems. Private thanks make it livable. Each matters. When Jamal called after that modest grant cleared, his voice carried both types of gratitude. He had learned to turn a title into a tool for others. I try to do the same, use whatever recognition comes my way to push resources where they are needed. There have been awkward encounters. People who long remember me as the daughter who cooked for family gatherings sometimes stumble, and I don't always correct them. A gentle let it go sometimes preserves relationships that matter more than a point of propriety. But increasingly the cost of silence feels heavier than the cost of correction. The simple act of stating a role, I'm Elaine, I run community programs, is still the most effective small rebellion I know. It redirects a conversation toward responsibility. I concentrate on teaching others to do the redirecting. Mr. Hargrove's ritual of handing out name tags became a lesson in legitimacy. I watch young leaders practice saying their titles in public and watch their peers respond with the habit of asking follow-ups. In workshops we practice naming with intention, not to aggrandize but to make visible the labor on which comfort depends. Training someone to introduce themselves precisely is a rehearsal for a different civic life. At home my parents' language continued to change. My mother recounts a meeting where she learned what a retention strategy was and why it mattered. My father's version of my work has become almost pastoral in its simplicity. She organizes the help. That shorthand translates in the corner store into practical questions. How can we help? Where do the volunteers sign up? Those aren't rhetorical queries, they are handholds. I try to institutionalize habits learned at kitchen tables. When I sit on panels or meet school administrators, I ask for credit lines on materials. When I review event programs, I hunt for invisible names and insist on change. It's tedious. It often draws eye rolls. But over time the effort accumulates. Programs adopt more precise language. Funders ask for named contributions. People in my neighborhood start to say, without awkwardness, "Thank you Marisol, for keeping the after-school program running," or "Thanks Jamal, for coordinating the translators." There is humility in this advocacy that I cherish. It's not about personal glory. It's about reshaping social grammars so that gratitude and accountability connect to real people. Sometimes that means standing in a room and saying someone else's name aloud with the care of handing them a coat. Sometimes it means quietly editing a brochure at midnight so a volunteer's role isn't erased. The casseroles and the name tags are part of the same project, making the scaffolding of care visible. The work is generational. Children learn faster than institutions. The 9-year-old who translated program coordinator at the school visit will carry that vocabulary forward in ways I cannot foresee. That is my solace. Small sentences become habits, habits become policy, policy changes how people think. The momentum is slow, often imperceptible day to day, but cumulative. I don't expect perfection. People revert to old comforts. There will be dinners when my parents, out of reflex, fall back into old shorthand. But now when that happens, someone, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a niece, will correct the record. The correction is no longer isolated defiance. It's part of a conversation that insists, patiently and persistently, that labor deserves a name and that a name often makes a life. There are details that show the slow accretion of change. A volunteer whose stipend line showed up in a budget because a board member who overheard a proper introduction asked why some contributors were unnamed. A school PTA that rewrote its newsletter policy to include credits because a teacher watched us model naming at a community table. A city office that updated an intake form to ask for specific roles rather than the generic volunteer checkbox after I showed them how granular language can shape program evaluation. Those changes were not dramatic, but they mattered. They meant that someone once invisible now had a place in a narrative that matched their labor. We built a simple guide based on these lessons, a living document not about rhetoric but logistics. It contains templates for consent when naming contributors, checklists to assess risks, instructions on when to anonymize, and scripts for public thanks that center the person being thanked. We ran workshops where we practiced these scripts aloud until they felt natural. We tested the consent forms in dozens of configurations, schools, mutual aid networks, immigrant resource centers, and revised them when workers told us the forms missed real-world complications. Safety often required saying less or nothing at all. Recognition had to be flexible. The guide also emphasized the mundane mechanics, minutes that record who did what, outdated job descriptions we rewrote into accurate titles, program evaluations that asked for named contributions rather than tallies. We learned that the most stubborn erasures weren't mean so much as lazy, an outdated brochure, a program itinerary that collapsed translators into staff, a funder report that listed volunteers without differentiation. Those small lapses had consequences. People who could have used a line on a resume didn't get one. A volunteer's labor that might have justified a stipend went invisible. Attending to these knots means writing clearer minutes, keeping lists updated, and giving explicit guidance to program administrators who default to simplification. I remember training a summer cohort of teenage leaders. We started small, introduce yourself, including a role. Most were uneasy, used to joking titles or nothing at all. We drilled until saying, "I'm Jamal, I coordinate outreach," felt like the same ordinary thing as saying your first name. Later, during a neighborhood street fair, two teenagers set up an information table and were asked by a reporter who they were. They said their names and their roles. The reporter wrote it down the same way reporters write quotes, as fact. Suddenly those teenagers had lines in the paper that made their work legible beyond the neighborhood's borders. That legibility opened doors, scholarship recommendations, internship leads, things that accrue over time. Not every correction is happy. There were evenings when a relative said the old shorthand out of embarrassment or reflex. Sometimes I didn't correct them because the temperature in the room made a correction feel like an escalation. But more often, the net effect of modest corrections has been to change how people think. I see it when a neighbor thanks a translator by name rather than by an anonymous thank you. I see it when a parent volunteer adds her title to a sign-in sheet and another parent asks to be connected with her. These small shifts of habit tack the world toward justice. I have learned to celebrate small victories. A printed program that finally lists every role accurately. A funder who asks for a breakdown of staff versus volunteers. A school newsletter that begins a new rubric on recognizing contributions. Each is a small instrument of dignity. They do not remake systems overnight, but they make daily life more truthful. There are also hard lessons. Naming can be weaponized. A program leader once told me about a volunteer whose public naming led to threats because of a custody dispute. We revised our consent protocols after that incident. Another colleague, undocumented and fearful, asked that her name be omitted from a plaque. We made space for her request and created an alternative recognition that respected her risk. The question of whether to speak someone's name is never purely sentimental. It's a calculus of safety and benefit. I also learned that certain forms of recognition require translation into resources. A title on a program page is good, but not if the person is struggling to pay for transit to get to the center. That's why I advocate that recognition be coupled with material support, stipends, transit cards, childcare coverage. Once, after a workshop on naming, a funding officer asked how to follow up. We suggested a small pilot stipend program tied to accurate titles and accountability measures. They approved a modest allocation. The pilot scaled because the named positions made clear who was doing distinct pieces of labor, and funders could see where resources mattered. These combinations of language and material change things. A translator who has both a named role and a small stipend can afford to attend meetings regularly. Their institutional knowledge no longer leaks away. A coordinator listed in minutes and program reports gains credibility when negotiating with schools or local agencies. These are not revolutionary moves, but they alter the distribution of care. I still see resistance. Bureaucracies prefer tidy simplicity, one checkbox, one default label.
Old habits cling like lint.
And yet, smallness is not weakness. A single sentence that corrects an introduction can teach a grammar. An unremarkable habit, handing out name tags, insisting people write their roles, becomes a ritual that trains a room to recognize. Sometimes I am ignored. But the accumulation matters. When I correct someone now, it's rarely to claim credit. It's to protect the labor of others and to train a room to speak more precisely. That is why I still carry the casserole lid. Because the smallest acts, serving food, handing someone a name tag, quietly editing a brochure at night, are part of a coherent politics. They assert that labor deserves recognition and that recognition should be matched with care. I think of Mr. Hargrove and his precise nod, of Jamal's phone call, of Marisol being thanked at an event. I think of the 9-year-old translating roles into a family language and the cousin who came with a box of books. I think of the woman at Thanksgiving who corrected an introduction and the ripple that followed. These are small instruments of change. So the work goes on. I hold my hand steady when I pass the casserole lid because steadiness itself is a lesson. When the next person is announced, someone will say both a name and a role. The room will listen. And if the room slips, someone else, sometimes an elder, sometimes a teenager, will correct it. Those corrections, repeated over time, become habit. Habits become policy. Policy changes how we see one another. I tell this not as a finished tale, but as a map. If you want to make dignity durable in your own space, begin with 3 practices. Insist on specificity in names, create consent-based protocols for recognition, and attach resources to the roles you name. Teach people to say their titles with ease. Insist on minutes that record contributions. Translate recognition into stipends when possible. Those practices are small and practical, and they travel. The moral of my experience is simple and persistent. Naming matters because it rewires attention. When we name labor, we make people legible. When they are legible, they can be counted, protected, and compensated. When they are protected and compensated, the work they do, translations, tutoring, sanitation contracts, scheduling, translation, does not vanish into someone's goodwill but becomes something a community sustains. There will always be people drawn to the comfort of simplified narratives. There will be seasons when funding dries up and names on paper fail to produce paychecks. But even then, the small systems we build, flyer credits, brief public thanks, forms that require specific roles, are instruments of accountability. They make it harder for good work to remain invisible. They offer a way to rally attention where it matters. This is how change accumulates, not in grand proclamations but in the tiny, repeated acts of naming and protecting. It is a grammar learned at kitchen tables and practiced at city council meetings. It is taught in workshops and modeled by elders who hand out name tags with a steady nod. It is a way of being that insists that labor, whoever performs it, deserves to be seen. There is stubborn joy in that. The joy is not in recognition for its own sake, but in the clearer pathways that recognition opens, more equitable resource flows, safer visibility, and the dignity that comes when someone's work is acknowledged as real work. That dignity travels on lists and minutes, on name tags and careful scripts, on consent forms and stipends. The casserole lid still bears the faint brown ring of baked food. It is lighter in my hands now because I no longer hide a title beneath it. I lay it down the way I would lay down a small lesson, with care and the expectation that others will pick it up. When the next dinner is called and the next person is introduced, the correction will be there, practiced and unfilched, a name, a role, and the room adjusted to receive it. The work goes on. It is stubborn, patient, and ordinary, and it changes things. The Thanksgiving I remember most clearly happened in a house that smelled like gravy and orange peels and the cheap air freshener my mother bought for company. My parents had invited a handful of neighbors, a cousin or two, and one man who came with a polite straightness in his coat and a name tag, Mr. Hargrove. He was a neighbor of a neighbor, a retired public school principal who kept odd hours volunteering at the adult literacy program down the block. He had a way, even then, of listening as if names were something to be tended. My parents introduced me with the old, embarrassed shorthand they had learned to use against the shame of invisibility. "This is our maid," my mother said, as if saying it 3 times would domesticate the truth. They laughed, as if they were making a joke that everyone understood. In that instant I could have walked away, let the laugh land, taken the plate of mashed potatoes, vanished into the kitchen to hide the ache. Instead, Mr. Hargrove tilted his head, and with the soft force of someone who had taught books to reluctant students, he corrected them. He spoke not with accusation but with the kind of plain, precise language that makes visible what had been folded away. "She's the outreach coordinator at the Immigrant Resource Center," he said. "She runs the volunteer trainings." The room stopped. The sentence landed like a small bell. For half a heartbeat, the pronoun she and the clause that followed rewired who I was in that particular domestic geography. My parents' faces changed from defensive amusement to something like recognition. Not that they had misnamed me maliciously, but that they had inherited a language that defaulted to domestic shorthand. The correction did not humiliate them, it taught the table a new grammar. That evening crystallized for me the difference between being domesticated by a label and being legible because of a title. It became a small hinge in a life that otherwise felt like a series of small corrections. Changing a program brochure here, editing a consent form there. It also acquainted me, privately and then quietly publicly, with the complicated politics of family and dignity. Families like mine, immigrant, working, often with histories of domestic labor, have a long relationship with titles and their social uses. My parents' shorthand emerged from decades of expectation. In many communities, the safest way to talk about work that is intimate and unprotected is to shrink it, to call it help or the maid, rather than to give it a professional name. That shrinking has roots farther back than any one household. Legislatively and culturally, domestic labor was written out of the protections other workers received. Indeed, since the late 1930s, when the New Deal's labor codifications excluded many domestic and agricultural workers from the earliest federal protections, a pattern of erasure was established. That legal erasure fed social erasure. If law refused to count certain work, popular speech often followed. The arc of domestic worker organizing, slow, patient, sometimes fierce, began to change that pattern in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Across cities and states, domestic workers, immigrant rights organizers, and allied labor unions fought to reclaim titles and, with them, rights. That campaign was not only about overtime pay and safety standards, it was about the grammar by which people were addressed at a holiday table. After that Thanksgiving, nothing dramatic happened overnight. My parents apologized, more to themselves than to me, for the habit. Friends who had been present began to introduce me differently in future gatherings. "That's my niece, she coordinates outreach at the center," someone would say, a corrective that traveled outward like a small current. The single sentence Mr. Hargrove offered that night became, for me, a model of civilian pedagogy, the practice of intervening to correct a misnaming without making the room adversarial. In the years that followed, I turned that impulse, correcting misnaming, into practice. In 2006, I began to work more regularly with neighborhood organizations. By 2009, I had helped draft what we informally called the Guide, a short manual for community recognition that collected our small, hard-won tactics. We published the first draft on a rainy November weekend and printed 10 stapled copies. The guide had humble sections: how to list translators on a program, how to ask for consent before featuring someone's image, how to write minutes that named contributions, and it began in a quiet way to travel. The guide's circulation coincided with larger historical shifts. In cities across the country, the conversation about immigrant labor, language access, and domestic work was changing. In 2010 and the years that followed, coalitions fought for local ordinances that recognized caregiving and cleaning work as labor, for school districts to hire and formally title their family liaisons, for hospitals to pay interpreters rather than relying on goodwill. Each victory made it easier to insist, in a parent-teacher meeting or at a Thanksgiving table, that the person who had been helped was a worker with responsibilities and expertise. The summer I trained the teenage cohort, I'll put that in 2014 because the heat was that heavy and the city parks were full of kids who smelled like sunscreen and determination. We started with introduction drills because we believed, in a stubborn way, that a single sentence could alter a trajectory. "I'm Jamal, I coordinate outreach," a kid would say, and it sounded ridiculous the first dozen times. By the end of the week, it did not sound ridiculous at all. We set practical tasks: run an information table, speak to a reporter, ask for a named credit. When Jamal and his friend were quoted in a neighborhood paper, the printed line became proof they could send with applications. The small recognition had ripple effects. The guide also had to contend with danger. Around 2012 we revised our consent protocols after a translator's name being printed led to threats against her because of a custody dispute. We learned to place safety above visibility in all cases. We developed options: named recognition, anonymous recognition, symbolic recognition, plaques with initials, reimbursements paid through intermediaries, small stipends labeled community contribution. These practical variants respected the reality that for some, naming is risky. Alongside consent and safety, we pushed for material changes because a title without resources is a kind of cruelty. The pilot stipend program, approved by a modest local foundation in 2016, was conceived as a test. We proposed a small line item for named roles on community programs: $25 to $50 per session, transit cards, childcare stipends. The foundation approved a $12,000 pilot over a year, enough to cover a dozen roles on rotating schedules. It was not revolutionary in scale, but it demonstrated the principle that naming could, and should, be followed by support. When funders could see who did what, their accounting changed. Reports started, tentatively, to list outreach coordinator versus volunteer, rather than lumping everyone into staff. Schools that once listed parent volunteer shifted to family liaison or after-school coordinator. These rubric changes had real consequences. People asked for letters of recommendation, applied for part-time paid positions, and were taken seriously in interagency negotiations. The changes accumulated. Resistance persisted. Bureaucracies like tidy defaults. A city department could still drop 5 roles into a volunteer box on an application form and expect the world to read a single word. At community meetings, some elders joked about showing off when someone named themselves in full. There were evenings when I sat between my mother's old habits and a youthful insistence on titles and felt the friction. Respecting elders who had survived undignified language required a different kind of naming, not erasing their stories but expanding the language available to them.
Mr.
Hargrove continued to be part of that story. In years after that Thanksgiving he came to events, and he knew how to introduce people in ways that taught rooms how to listen. This is Marisol. She manages our scheduling for the legal clinic. This is the woman who translates for our elders. He would pause, let the title settle, and then ask a follow-up question that forced the room to place value where it belonged. How long have you been doing that work? That question, simple as it was, turned a label into a history. When a name acquired duration, it acquired weight. Marisol's arc shows the compound effect of those small recognitions. She was our translator for a few summers, then our scheduling lead, then the person who taught new recruits how to read bureaucratic forms. When we finally put her role on a printed program in 2017, she was able to use that line on a resume, and when a district hiring manager called, the named credit made the call possible. Recognition threaded together into opportunity. There were political moments, too. In 2018 and 2019, local initiatives to expand access to paid sick leave and to require translation services in municipal agencies made our small practices less idiosyncratic. Public discussion about the value of care work increased. The cultural conversation, about who counted as a worker and who was just family or the help, shifted, not entirely because of our guide or our stipend pilot, but because those small efforts were part of a larger chorus demanding change. By 2020, with a pandemic that revealed the brittle inequalities of essential labor, the case for accurate naming became urgent. Suddenly, the people we had labored to make legible, the translators, the community coordinators, the parent organizers, were recognized as essential in public policy debates. That recognition did not magically resolve all structural exclusion. In many cases it simply made visible the debt we owed. But visibility assisted in an important way. It allowed for targeted emergency support, for hazard pay in some places, for inclusion in vaccine outreach. Again, naming did not fix structural injustice, but it enabled interventions that would not have happened if those workers remained linguistically invisible. Across these years, I kept the casserole lid. It traveled from one pantry to another as I moved apartments and as my family adjusted to new incomes and new cities. The faint brown ring on its underside became a map of dinners where a name was offered or corrected. I came to think of it as both a prop and a pedagogy, a small domestic object whose presence in a room was a reminder that the personal and the political overlap in kitchen conversations. I do not tell this story to claim that correction is a panacea. There are institutions whose inertia requires force as well as gentle correction. Laws to be passed, budgets to be reallocated, social movements to be sustained. But I tell it because of the particular way grammar shapes possibility. When someone at a table has their work voiced with a title, the trajectory of that work changes. Names cross thresholds, into minutes, into grant applications, into the files of people who make hiring decisions. They accumulate then into a modest kind of structural remnant, an archived resume, a dated program, a city mailing list. This is the history I see when I look back from the present moment. It is not a grand narrative of seismic events so much as a chart of small corrections accumulating into policy and practice. In homes and community centers, in city council meetings and on stapled guides, we taught each other to say outreach coordinator instead of the maid, to ask consent before printing a name, to attach a transit stipend to a title. There are still evenings when my parents default to old jokes. They do not mean harm, they mean comfort. But now, When someone in the room says with a steady voice, "She's our outreach coordinator," they are likely to adjust. Sometimes an elder will correct our younger relatives. Sometimes a teenager will step forward and insist on the full title. Sometimes, years later, a funding officer who remembers a young person in a newspaper clipping will call to offer a small paid role. The changes are incremental and often delayed, but they are real. Looking forward, the work remains to stitch these small naming practices into the fabric of institutions. We must keep teaching rooms how to speak. We must keep designing consent forms that protect. We must keep attaching resources to roles. We must also continue to tell a broader history, that the invisibility of domestic and immigrant labor has policy roots and that its remedy requires both linguistic precision and material redistribution. The casserole lid sits on my shelf as a modest talisman of that insistence, that what we call one another matters, and that the words we choose can open doors that had long been bolted. When the next Thanksgiving comes, someone at a table will correct an introduction, and the room will remember how to listen. In the months after March 2020, when the city first shut down, the naming work we had been doing felt both vindicated and tenuous. The immediate emergency revealed how much government and philanthropy relied on people who were called the help at dinner tables, but who were technically indispensable to the city's functioning: language access coordinators who translated hours-long testing rollouts, parent organizers who rerouted school supplies, community liaisons who mapped seniors' needs for groceries and medicine. The linguistics of our guide, how to ask permission to attach a name to a photo, how to place a title on a program, suddenly mattered in triage contexts. In April and May of 2020, when vaccines and later testing appointments were scarce, municipal offices and health clinics reached for the networks that had been built precisely through those named roles. It mattered because a named person is a person with a contact and an employer and, crucially, a record. When a mobile vaccination clinic needed interpreters, they could no longer rely on an ad hoc lineup of well-intentioned neighbors. Contracts required named hires, signed W-9s for stipends, and proof of consent for outreach materials. The fact that we had started, 6 years earlier, to ask for named credits and small transit reimbursements made the difference between being pulled in as an anonymous volunteer and being hired as a coordinator with a paycheck, however modest. In the pandemic's logic, where logistics decided who lived and who waited in line, the grammar of a resume could save a person hours of waiting and sometimes money or a slot. By 2021, there were municipal decisions that reflected this change. A city health department, pushed by a coalition that included our group and other neighborhood organizers, codified a modest policy: translational and outreach roles engaged by emergency providers should be offered contracts through a central vendor list and paid at an emergency rate. It was not a sweeping policy, it was a pragmatic addendum to existing emergency procurement rules. Still, it created precedents. Clinics that had previously called for volunteers to help with interpretation began to phrase those requests as contractual bilingual outreach positions. The language altered procurement paperwork and created a narrow but real pathway to income. The foundation that had funded our 2016 stipend pilot renewed support in late 2021, awarding a larger grant to scale what we had learned into a regional model. The original $12,000 pilot had been enough to rotate a dozen roles. This new grant, roughly 4 times larger, allowed us to hire a part-time coordinator and to offer formalized stipends to nearly 3 dozen individuals over 18 months. We used the money not to inflate salaries but to professionalize: formal position descriptions, short-term contracts, background checks when required, and, importantly, the option to accept payment through intermediary nonprofits for those who needed anonymity. We also expanded the guide into a downloadable PDF, translated versions in Spanish and Mandarin, and an editable template for consent forms. In December 2021, we sent that digital guide to a list of 127 organizations. Within 6 months, it had been downloaded by groups in 3 neighboring counties. Those downloads did not equate to uniform adoption. In 2022, a municipal audit of school community partnerships revealed that while some schools had moved from parent volunteer to family liaison in their rosters, others had relabeled named positions as community partners and left compensation ambiguous. The audit's language mattered. It documented where naming led to wages and where naming remained decorative. Advocates used the audit to press for budget lines that would support family liaisons as paid staff rather than as unpaid goodwill. In a handful of districts, school boards approved small recurring stipends in the 2022 to 2023 school year, enabling family liaisons to claim hours on payroll rather than ask for occasional reimbursements. Marisol's career trajectory illustrates how these piecemeal changes aggregated. In 2017, her role on a program flyer helped her land a call. By 2020, that call turned into a consistent part-time job helping families navigate remote learning schedules. In 2021, as schools reopened and grappling with learning loss intensified, the district offered Marisol a one-year contract as a family liaison with an explicit salary and benefits eligibility. She accepted. By mid-2022, she had started teaching a monthly workshop for other liaisons and translators. How to file expense reports, how to protect confidentiality when sharing case studies, how to seek letters of reference. When she described that workshop in an interview last winter for a municipal community health fellowship, her resume had dated lines that connected summer translation gigs to formalized municipal work and to a fellowship evaluation. Each dated line, 2014 Summers, 2017 Brochure, 2020 Remote Learning Coordinator, was a small credential buttressing the next. Jamal, the teenager who practiced introductions in 2014, became representative of a different pathway. He used his outreach coordinator credit on applications for internships and, by 2023, had been hired as a community engagement assistant for a public housing authority. In that role, he drafted outreach emails, managed an interpreter schedule, and sat in coordination meetings where, crucially, his title signaled that he had bargaining power. He could ask for a budget for bilingual flyers and for transport stipends. He could request that his role be consulted early in program design rather than retrofitted as an afterthought. This kind of institutional position, paid and on the inside, was one of the long-sought goals of our early guide, to convert the invisible labor of relationship building into something legible and resourced. Not all progress was linear. There was a conservative backlash in some quarters about the professionalization of community care. Critics argued that labeling and paying people would bureaucratize relationships that were supposed to be voluntary and organic. Some elder organizers decried the idea that a neighborly phone call could be monetized. These critiques were important. They forced us to refine consent protocols and to be clear that naming and paying did not mean the end of mutual aid. In practice, we learned to offer options. A role could be voluntary with formal recognition, it could be paid for specific hours, it could be an unpaid convener compensated for expenses. The guide increasingly included an ethical appendix: how to negotiate boundaries when neighbors became contractors, how to avoid creating dependency, how to ensure that pay did not imply surveillance. Mr. Hargrove remained a quiet corrective in those debates. He came to a roundtable in late 2022 and asked a simple question that remembered the Thanksgiving table's pedagogical edge: if we honor the work, who is responsible for training? The question reminded everyone that naming carried obligations. Once we called someone an outreach coordinator, the organization owed them support, access to materials, and a chain of accountability. He pushed for mentorship lines within contracts, so that part-time coordinators could shadow experienced staff and have recourse to a supervisor who understood both labor law and community context. This insistence on reciprocity, title matched with training and supervision, helped convince a few funders that stipends should be tied to professional development offerings. In 2023, a small but influential municipal resolution required that emergency communication materials be vetted by named translators before publication and that outreach budgets include line items for community review. It was the sort of administrative foothold that rarely wins headlines. But it mattered to those who were often last in the queue. When translations were pre-approved, outreach became less haphazard. When community reviewers were named and compensated, their labor acquired monetary value and institutional respect. The cumulative effect was visible at local events. Program brochures listed translators and liaisons by title and scope. Meeting minutes began to note the contributions of named community reviewers. Grant proposals attached short bios to named roles. The casserole lid continued to travel with me through this period. It sat on the shelf of every apartment as the work moved from stapled copies to PDFs and as the pandemic receded into an uneven aftermath. Sometimes it was visible at small gatherings, an index of the domestic origins of this labor. Once, in November 2023, at a Thanksgiving held in a community center rather than a private home, a woman in a volunteer coordinator badge walked in carrying a casserole, placed the lid between the serving dishes, and announced, with a formal dignity that made room for tenderness, "This is Anna. She coordinates our nutrition program." The room shifted. A city council aide nearby made notes. Later that week, the aide forwarded Anna's contact to a social services manager seeking a short-term contract. It was the pattern we had seen before: naming-enabled outreach that led to employment. The national conversation about care work deepened in 2024, even as it remained contested. Federal funding streams expanded in some areas, allowing localities to pilot hazard pay and to fund language access programs for limited periods. These infusions were often temporary, contingent on epidemiological data or political will. Yet they did create short-term salaries that allowed a handful of community coordinators to move from stipends to multi-month contracts, accrual of benefits, or eligibility for unemployment protections during program downtimes. Those material changes, small and precarious, altered household calculations. Being called the liaison, rather than the neighbor, now meant the difference between a person being owed a check and being owed a favor. Throughout these years, the struggle remained cultural as well as legal. I found myself, repeatedly at family tables, correcting introductions in subtle ways. In late 2024, my mother still quipped the maid when we hosted relatives, and my father laughed in the old pattern of comfort. But this time there were more people to check him. A niece, now 21 and formerly in our 2014 cohort, would step forward and say, "She's our scheduling lead for the clinic," and the room would recalibrate. Those small domestic corrections were part of a broader shift. They were teaching exercises in dignity. They also created genealogies. When someone asked, "How long have you been doing that work?" a narrative followed, and that narrative could be mailed to an employer. By 2025, our guide had become an informal standard referenced in grant applications and municipal memoranda. It had not been institutionalized into law. There were still places where volunteer remained a catch-all and where naming meant little for compensation, but its practices had permeated a range of institutions: clinics, school districts, housing authorities, community colleges. The guide's digital metrics, downloads and shares, were less important than the archival traces: printed programs with dates, formal resumes listing family liaison or translation coordinator, municipal procurement records that cited the guide's consent templates. Collectively, these traces functioned as a public memory, a way future auditors, researchers, and amici could prove that certain people had long performed essential work. There were human stories I could name. A translator who had feared naming in 2012 because of a custody dispute found, by 2023, legal support that allowed her to accept anonymized recognition and later to accept a paid, confidential contract. A retired school custodian who had joked about volunteers in 2015 became a paid community advisor in 2024 after the district formally created a stipend-based advisory board. These individual outcomes, each modest, accumulated into patterns. More people had documented histories of labor. More of those histories could be verified for job applications. More civic processes became, incrementally, responsive to the real distribution of work. Yet the larger structural questions remain. Naming does not automatically rebalance a labor market that privileges credentialed experience over community knowledge. It cannot, by itself, redistribute municipal budgets or erase centuries of marginalization. What it can do is create pathways. A named role can be translated into a resume line, a budget ask, an audit footnote. For someone whose first public recognition came when an aunt corrected a Thanksgiving introduction, that small correction can be the hinge by which other doors swing open. Mr. Hargrove has aged visibly in these years, his hair thinner, his patience steadier. He still attends events, still practices introductions like a ritual. When he asks someone at a roomful of strangers, "How long have you done this work?" his question continues to perform a subtle kind of historiography. It asks for memory, it insists on duration. He taught entire rooms how to listen for time as well as title. I think of him when the casserole lid clatters softly in my cupboard. The lid is a domestic archive, stains as data points, dents as marginalia, holding small stories of tables where people were corrected, where names were said aloud and then recorded. As 2026 approaches, the tasks are clear in both tactical and chronologic terms. Continue to demand named roles in procurement and grants, build stronger mentorship lines into short-term contracts, push for recurring budget allocations for family liaisons and translators, and preserve the stories that prove duration and expertise. We must keep teaching rooms how to speak and institutions how to budget. We must also keep refining consent to protect those for whom visibility is dangerous, And we must hold funders accountable when they praise naming without providing sustained lines for livelihoods. The narrative arc I inhabit is neither triumphalist nor fatalistic. It is a record of incremental shifts that make certain futures possible. When the next Thanksgiving comes, there will be familiar habits to unsettle, new policies to test, and people whose titles will still be learning to hold weight. The casserole lid will be on my shelf, a quiet witness to the history of corrections that began at a table and extended into procurement forms and municipal memos. And, as always, someone in the room will say a name aloud and the room will have to decide whether to listen for the title or for the person behind it. When the calendar turned to 2026, the work felt less like an experiment and more like a field of practices that needed tending. The months that followed were a series of small, administratively precise victories and stubborn cultural holds. In February, the city's budget office circulated a proposal, drafted in collaboration with a community advisory board that had been formally named in 2025, to create a recurring line item for community liaison stipends. The proposal was modest, 3 full-time equivalents phased in over 2 fiscal years, accompanied by an allocation for mentorship hours and a small professional development fund. The language in the budget memo echoed the guide's templates almost verbatim. It referenced named community reviewers, and required that vendors include community-verified translations as a precondition for payment. The memo was a bureaucratic thing, drab with tables and projected costs, but its prose carried the cumulative labor of a decade: consent checklists, template agreements, a paragraph on confidentiality for people who were undocumented or in precarious housing. In March 2026, the City Council held a public hearing that felt, oddly intensely, like a hometown revisiting of that Thanksgiving table. One by one, people who had been corrected at family suppers, who had once been introduced as the maid or just helping out, stood at the microphone and read aloud their job histories. A woman named Rosa, who had translated eviction notices for neighbors since 2017, held up a printed resume with Housing Outreach Coordinator, informal, 2017 to 2023, and explained how the lack of formal recognition had harmed her ability to apply for a union-side legal defense fund in 2021. A retired teacher described hosting weekly curriculum nights and being paid only in snacks until 2022, when her work was named and she was offered a small stipend. The council members listened. Some were moved, some skeptical, some already attuned because their aides had read the guide and passed on Mr. Hargrove's question, "How long have you done this work?" The budget line passed with amendments in late April. It was not sweeping: 3 positions, a $60,000 pilot fund for community review contracts, and $15,000 for training and supervision. But in municipal politics, formalized budgets are adhesive. Agencies began to adjust procurement language. The Housing Authority issued a request for proposals in June that required bidders to list community liaison partners, and to document training pathways for any named coordinators. The school district adopted a policy that fall requiring community translators to be named on communication materials in September 2026, and for those translators to receive a modest fee for each review cycle. The forms and the memos multiplied, but they did not erase the awkward domestic rituals that remained. At my parents' house in November 2026, the Thanksgiving ritual still began with my father standing and offering a blessing that included a gag about hiring help that he had been telling for 30 years. My mother, who had adapted to many of my corrections over the years but retained a fondness for the old scripts, introduced me with a half-smile. "This is Anna, she's the maid, she keeps us in line." The room chuckled out of habit. But this particular table had more institutional actors than in years past. A council aide who had shepherded the budget line, a coordinator from the school district who was testing the translation policy, and a neighbor who had been on the advisory board. They did not laugh. They waited for my correction. I could have performed one of the gentle, educative clarifications I had practiced for years. Instead, the council aide took the moment before I could and said to everyone, "She's our family liaison for the neighborhood clinic. She's been doing this work for 8 years." The sentence landed like a ledger entry. My father's joke folded into silence. My mother's smile faltered in a way that felt, to me, like a page turning. After dinner, the aide asked for my card, and before dessert plates hit the sink, she had scrolled through her phone to show me an email thread with a staffing manager asking whether our liaison could be available for a contracted schedule during flu season. The presence of that aide at our table reframed the family ritual into a small municipal transaction, It was a demonstration that the acts of domestic correction could alter fiscal flows. That Thanksgiving became, in our circle, an anecdote about how public and private logics intertwine. But it also raised questions about proximity and power. If an aide's presence could transform a joke into a job lead, what about those friends and relatives who did not have access to such networks? In response, the advisory board proposed a table-to-contract protocol in early 2027, a compact that outlined steps for converting informal recognition into formal opportunities without relying on serendipity. The protocol recommended that institutions create low-barrier application processes, no phalanx of HR forms, and offered a template for confidentiality when visibility was dangerous. It included a clause that no single in-room benefactor should be the gatekeeper. Instead, referrals were to be accompanied by public postings and anonymized verification when necessary. By mid-2027, the pilot spawned another administrative product, a 3-month on-ramp program for people newly named on municipal materials. The on-ramp combined legal counseling, digital literacy training for time cards and invoices, and shadowing in municipal offices. Its first cohort included 5 people, a translator who had only accepted anonymous work until 2023, a former neighborhood watch convener, a parent who had coordinated school lunch sign-ups for 6 years, a man who had mediated landlord-tenant meetings since 2019, and myself. We met in a windowed room above a community center, and the curriculum felt intentionally modest: how to read a municipal job description, how to track hours for reimbursement, where to ask for supervision. We practiced saying titles aloud and mapping those titles to specific competencies. The program's evaluation after 3 months showed small but measurable gains. Participants submitted more formal resumes, asked for modest pay rates rather than piecemeal reimbursements, and reported increased confidence when introduced at meetings. These administrative successes did not pacify the opposition. In late 2027, a local conservative advocacy group published an op-ed decrying paid neighborliness. The piece argued that stipends would erode community bonds and convert generosity into transactions. The op-ed prompted a city council briefing in January 2028. Mr. Hargrove attended. He read the op-ed and, in his slow, deliberate manner, asked whether the group had considered how unpaid labor has long sustained municipal functions that now require accountability. He reminded the council that naming had never been intended to monetize friendship, but to make visible labor that already sustained public systems. His remarks were a public reiteration of the debate that had begun at our Thanksgiving table: naming as recognition, not commodification. Parallel to these municipal arguments, there were legal and organizational shifts. A small cohort of community liaisons in 2 adjacent cities began to organize informally in 2028 to negotiate consistent rates for translation and review work. They were not a union in the technical sense. The work was too heterogeneous and dependent on intermittent contracts, but their coordination fostered norms. They created a rate sheet that municipal agencies and nonprofits could consult. It listed baseline fees for document review, on-site translation, and community advisory meetings. The existence of a rate sheet made budgets more predictable. It also made clear who should be paid and by how much. Vendors could not plausibly argue that they had no line item for translators when a publicly referenced rate sheet suggested otherwise. Material changes proliferated in small ways. A woman who had been introduced as helping out since 2014 found, in 2028, a year-round contract that converted her monthly stipend into payroll, with employer contributions for health benefits. She could, for the first time, schedule surgery without fear of income loss. An outreach coordinator who had suffered a workplace injury while translating in 2026 received retroactive compensation after a municipal audit cited the city's own consent templates that had been disregarded.